So we've been talking about case study designs, and we introduced some different ways that case study designs get used in research, right? So it could be to generate hypotheses, or it could be this is something I'm interested in and I want to understand more about, or it could be I'm trying to establish causality and really nail down that these two things are linked. And while those are ways that case studies get used in a research context, that logic of case studies as a way to understand the world and analyze the world and give you some useful information gets used in a more professional applied setting and is used by many organizations as part of their management practice. And so I'd like to talk about some of those different applications of the case study logic and some of the maybe red flags that can go along with that. So probably the most common way that the logic of case studies is used by organizations for management purposes is the generation of best practices, where we look at successful projects and try to figure out what made that project or that program or that policy successful. And ideally, we can then replicate that success by knowing what made that initial case so successful. Likewise, it could be a lessons learned kind of thing. So you could have a project or a program that maybe wasn't as great or maybe collapsed horribly, and you want to understand why that was so that you don't replicate those mistakes, right? So you're going to a case and looking for lessons learned. And organizations will frequently do this as a way to sort of improve their organizational performance. And while that on the surface seems like a really good strategy, right? I'm looking at what happened to try to figure out what went wrong. Methodologically, it's problematic. And what I mean by that is that it's essentially doing what we did with hypothesis generation. Here's a case that did really well or really poorly. I want to develop some ideas about why that might be. But in a research context, those ideas wouldn't be considered to be truth or proven or correct. They would just be hypotheses. This is something I think this is how the world works. And so I need to take some next steps to kind of figure out if that's actually true. In an applied practical way, the lessons learned and best practices piece oftentimes get adopted as if they've been proven. And this is really bad. It's bad. It falls into a methodological trap that really produces suspect results, which is selecting on the dependent variable. I'm interested in what makes organizations successful. I select an organization that's successful and I look at it and I find that in this organization that is successful, people show up to work at 7:30. Okay, I have something. People are showing up to work at 7:30. Early bird gets the worm. That's why this organization is successful. But it turns out that every organization that's, I should say every organization, I oftentimes show up in my office at 9 because I have more flexible hours, but many organizations, right? The culture is you get in early, and lots of organizations that failed also had that culture of you show up early and, hit the ground running. And so is it that there was this particular practice in this organization that made it successful, or was everybody doing that and it had no sort of effect on what distinguishes those who were successful from those who weren't? And we really can't know that by just looking at the successful cases. Likewise, if we're looking at things that failed, if you're just looking at things that failed, you don't know what it is that makes those organizations fail or what led to that bad outcome unless you're able to contrast it with good outcomes. And oftentimes with the best practices and lessons learned management approach, you're not actually doing that. And so you might be keying in on things that aren't actually related to success or failure. But you don't know that if you only looked at success or you only looked at failure. Okay, so enough of my discussion about how this is really a bad methodological practice because nobody's going to change it. I think it's just worth highlighting and putting that out there. All right, so another way that the case study logic gets used for organizations and management is with benchmarking. So particularly in universities, but also in a lot of public organizations where you don't have profit as a way to evaluate whether your organization is doing a good job or not. And you have to kind of figure out whether or not you're successful and you're using resources efficiently. And one way to do that is compare yourself to others who are doing similar kinds of things and whether they're doing them better than you or worse than you. And one of the ways that organizations will do this is by identifying peer organizations and maybe even aspirant organizations that are doing a little bit better, they're in a better position that you'd like to sort of target and be like in the future, versus peer organizations. These are organizations that are like you. They're in a similar situation to you. And you can kind of monitor what they're doing. And if they're all adopting a particular thing and it seems to be working well for them, maybe you should be adopting that new software, that new practice as well, because it seems to be a thing that organizations are doing. This is kind of similar to the comparative method logic of most similar case designs, because when we pick peer and aspirant organizations, we're looking for organizations that are like our organization. We want organizations that are comparable, that if we wanted to, we could be like that organization in terms of output and outcomes, not an organization that's radically different, right? And so if you are a community college, you don't select Harvard as your peer organization. You choose another community college, maybe in a neighboring city. Right? That would be an organization that would be doing similar kind of things, that have similar kind of resources, that have similar kind of goals, that might have similar kind of students, right? Inputs and outputs and all that stuff would be similar. And so you can use that to kind of get a sense of, am I doing a good job or not? Okay, so just again, comparative method logic being used in more of a managerial sense. And then I've got one more example of this, the comparative method logic being used in an applied way. And this is the idea of positive deviance. And this is something that kind of emerged in the 1970s. It was developed by a couple they were Peace Corps volunteers in Vietnam, and they were tasked with sort of addressing, I think, like child malnutrition in villages in Vietnam. And it emerged out of a conversation between this couple and folks in this village about the relationship between poverty and malnutrition, right? And I think you'd assume, like intuitively, right, that families that are poorer would have a bigger problem with child malnutrition. And sure enough, that was like the conclusion that everybody began with. But the question was asked, well, is that true for everybody? Is everybody in this village who's poor, are their children malnourished? And when people sort of stepped back and thought about every family and kind of did the calculation, like, well, actually, there's like this family, they live on the edge of the village. They're like the poorest of the poor, but their kids are doing pretty well. They're like growing and they're strong and they're healthy. And you wouldn't, they're sort of unusual, right? That's the positive deviance case. Positive in that we're getting a good outcome, right? The thing that we're looking for, the thing that we want. And deviance, it's not behaving the way that we normally would expect it to behave. Something about that family was breaking with the normal pattern. And so the idea is you go to that family and you try to analyze them and try to figure out, what are they doing different from all their neighbors? And it turned out that because of the grinding poverty, this particular family was foraging in the forest. I think they were getting like mushrooms or like some sort of root vegetable or something. And that was they were supplementing their diet with that, but that ended up having like some of the missing nutrients that wasn't in the regular staples of food. And as a result, even though they were getting less of sort of the rice and the basic staples, they were getting the nutrients that the kids needed, and the kids were growing and healthy because of it. And the idea of positive deviance is that we're essentially using the comparative method. All of these cases, all of these families are basically in the same situation. And if one family has figured out how to solve a problem using the resources and the environment that's available to everybody, then in theory, that solution should be transferable to everybody, that everybody in theory could go and forage in the forest and find mushrooms and root vegetables and supplement their diet that way and get this missing nutrients that are needed for children to not be malnourished. And in fact, that's what happens with this case, with this situation in Vietnam, is that they essentially crack the code for how to use the resources that exist in the local environment to get better outcomes, better child nutrition. Is a massively successful public health intervention of trying to supplement diets with what's already there. And one of the things that makes positive deviance so powerful is that it's using internal solutions. A lot of development work is outsiders, typically Westerners, showing up and saying, "Here, you should be doing this. Why aren't you doing it this way?" Or, you know, try to make your farming practices or your health practices or your whatever practices look like what we are doing in the West. And that may not be appropriate for the environment, for the culture, for the situation. Whereas these are solutions that emerge within the context and therefore will work within the context. And it's also based on that logic of the comparative method. Everything's more or less the same. We find the case that's weird. We find, in a good way, positive deviance. We find what makes that case weird, and we just crack the code. So it's a really interesting method, and I think it's a really interesting application of the comparative method. And I got a link here to a video that talks about positive deviance in Malaysia in terms of malaria control. And so it's, again, just another way in which we see sort of the logic of research methods having sort of filtered its way into how organizations operate and how people approach the world and how we solve problems.